Welcome back. We are now ready to start the second part of the program, where we're going to focus on inequality and the implications of the many facets of inequality. And we have a keynote, and I'm going to turn it over to Lila Bengali to begin the discussion with our keynote. Lila.
Excellent. Thank you, Jerry. So it is my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker today. Our keynote speaker is Mary C. Daly. Mary C. Daly is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. As a participant of the Federal Open Market Committee, she helped set American monetary policy. Since taking office in October 2018, Dr. Daly has committed to making the San Francisco Fed a more community-engaged bank that is transparent and responsive to the people it serves. Dr. Daly began her career with the San Francisco Fed in 1996. She currently and has in the past served on a wide variety of advisory boards. To give just a small sample, the Center for First Generation Student Success, Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, and the Congressional Budget Office. Dr. Daly earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a master's degree from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD from Syracuse University. He also completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University. Now, neither this brief introduction nor the full bio on our conference page do justice to her distinguished career. We are thrilled to have Mary joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Mary C. Daly. Mary, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Lila, and good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to take the privilege of having the floor to say that there's few things that are as wonderful and give people as much gratitude as having someone who is a research assistant or a student of yours actually get their PhD and then introduce you at an event of this magnitude. So Lila, I am beaming with pride today to see you in this role, and thank you again so much for having me. So as Americans, one of our most deeply held beliefs is that anyone, no matter where they come from or who they are, can make it. They just have to play hard or work hard and play by the rules. Playing hard doesn't help either, doesn't hurt. This assumption that anyone can make it permeates our political system, our institutions, and our economy. But crises can be illuminating, and the pandemic has shined a vivid light on the very deep roots of inequity, forcing us to recognize that the rules aren't always the same for everyone. And when you look at it, you can clearly see that COVID has taken the most from the people and the communities least able to bear it. And longstanding gaps in economic opportunity and well-being have grown deeper and wider. Now, as humans, we are adaptive. We get used to things pretty quickly. We live a certain way long enough, and we begin to believe that that's just the way it's supposed to be. And so we forget. We forget that the gaps we see every day reflect accumulated inequities, the long tail of policy, luck, or inattention that has made it easier for some and harder for others. And then an economy that leaves large numbers of people behind starts to seem normal. So today I'm going to talk about why this way of looking at the world limits our potential, and how we can use the lessons of the pandemic to forge a more equitable society, one with fewer gaps and greater prosperity for all. Before I go on, though, it's important to remind you that the views I will express are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else within the Federal Reserve System. So before we imagine a more equitable world, it's important to take stock of the world we have. Economists and many others frequently assume that resources are allocated to their most productive uses and that all available resources are fully deployed. Unless there is blatant market failure, including collusion, discrimination, or other obvious barriers to entry, we believe that any differences in initial conditions, how people start out, will smooth out over time. In other words, as I said before, no matter where you are or who you are or how you begin, the marketplace will ensure that you land where you're supposed to be. And there frankly are many examples of this being true. Inspiring stories of people starting with little and doing a lot. Confirming, if you will, our belief that markets work efficiently and human capital is put to its best uses with few mistakes. But this view can also be misleading. It can make us think that the world we have is all that the world could ever be. And this bridles our economy's potential. It leaves countless people contributing less than their talents and interests would allow. And it sometimes sidelines them completely. So to get a sense of what we stand to gain from building a world with fewer gaps, it's useful to review what some of the disparities look like. Many groups fare less well than the averages we hear about each day. But disparities for Black Americans, many of whom bear the cost of both historical and current discrimination, are especially sizable. So their experiences are an important starting point. And the differences start at a young age. The average Black child in the United States is about 3 times more likely to live in a poor household, one with resources below the official poverty line. Black children are relatively less likely to graduate from high school and even less likely to go to college. Black students who do go to college frequently don't finish. In fact, a recent study found that at the 6-year mark after being enrolled, 45% had not graduated and were no longer even registered or enrolled at the college. By comparison, only 27% of white students had left at 6 years without graduating. But the gaps don't end with education. They continue on into the labor market and beyond. Black college graduates are less likely to be employed, and when they do find jobs, are more likely to be in occupations that don't utilize or even require their skills. And this translates directly into lower average earnings for Black Americans, even when they have college degrees. Perhaps most troubling, though, is that college-educated Black workers lose ground over their careers. Indeed, in work I've done, we found that the earnings gap between Black and white college-educated men doubles over the first 15 years of their professional life. In the end, putting all of these facts together, this means that fewer Black men and women are contributing their full potential to the economy. But the gaps don't stop there. Hispanic Americans, women, Indigenous Americans, people living in rural areas, and many other groups persistently fall behind with lower rates of education, employment, and earnings than we might expect if opportunities were more equally available to everyone. Leaving these gaps unaddressed is clearly unfair, a social problem. But it's also unproductive, which is an economic problem. It keeps millions of people on the sidelines or underutilized and sells the economy short. No entrepreneur, if you think of it, would ever stand for it. And so the question is, why do we? Well, I'll offer a reason that isn't often talked about, but here it is. We don't fully understand what we're missing. We don't regularly calculate the losses from exclusion or the potential gains from being a more inclusive economy. We don't do this on an aggregate level. We don't even do it on a state level. So my colleagues and I recently did just that. We asked a simple question. What would the economic output of the nation be if gaps by race and ethnicity were erased? For each year from 1990 through 2019, we eliminated gaps in employment, hours, education, and educational utilization. We just gave the racial and ethnic minorities in our sample the values of their white counterparts. We then recomputed the potential output for each year, And what we found was significant. When gaps are closed, the gains from equity are nearly $23 trillion more output over a 30-year period. A large piece of economic pie simply left on the table because we continue to tolerate the gaps we see. Other studies using different methods and closing different gaps have found similar gains, all confirming that a more inclusive economy helps everyone. But how will we get there? And that's an important question. Well, a recent study by scholars at Stanford University and the University of Chicago provides some clues. They look back in time and examine the economic impact of taking down barriers to entry to the labor market for women and Black workers in the 50 years spanning 1960 to 2010. And you find that better allocation of these workers, getting them into the occupations that they were meant to do, putting them into industries that were previously prohibited, putting talent where it was needed, accounted for up to 40% of the total growth in US output over that period. And that's a big number. So this is their research tells us over 40% of the total growth measured over that period, they found could be attributed to taking down barriers that allowed people to be allocated to where they were meant to be. And then they went on to show that most of this improvement, this 40% gain, came from reducing human capital barriers, ripping down barriers that kept women or Black Americans out of areas where they had previously been prohibited or just not very prevalent. All this tells us that taking down barriers for some improved output for all. So again and again, these and other studies make it clear that using all of our resources more fully improves aggregate prosperity. And it's important to stop there and see what that means. It means that we're not actually trying to more equally divide a static and unchanging pie, but rather by including more people, the economic pie is bigger. But another important point is that the gains to our economic output go beyond, at least are likely to go beyond, just boosting the size of the pie, the level of GDP. Reducing disparities could also increase the economy's long-run rate of growth, which is important to determining how fast the pie grows in the future. So to understand this insight, we need to go back to the 1980s, when future Nobel laureate Paul Romer had an idea many of you are familiar with. He hypothesized that the true driver of economic growth is ideas, innovations in thinking that lead to the development of new technologies, higher productivity, and a faster growth rate over the longer run. In other words, in his hypothesis, ideas determine how quickly the economic pie grows. So if you follow his theory through, it tells us that we can boost GDP growth by investing in strategies that foster the development and implementation of ideas. And not just for a few people, but for everyone. The more people participating in idea generation, the more idea generation we get. So what are some strategies for doing that? Well, the first and I think most obvious strategy is to increase access to high quality education and the academic supports needed to help students stay on course. It's pretty hard to find anyone who doesn't understand that education equips people with the knowledge and skills they need to innovate. And it doesn't always take a 4-year degree. And I think this is important. Think of all the computer programmers out there now who started coding as kids. So investing in students at an early age and offering them a pathway to learn and participate is equally important. Of course, another way to encourage idea generation and idea implementation is to create more equitable ways to fund them, more equitable paths to get them into our society or our economy. It's clear that wealth enables people to implement their ideas. But if you look at wealth gaps, they're large in our country, and racial and ethnic minorities are especially far behind. Gaps in financing or borrowing to fund ideas, an alternative to having your own wealth to spend, are also large, and largely fall along the same lines of racial and ethnic minorities having less access than other groups. So when you pull this through, this means that whole communities of people have less financial support for putting their innovations into practice. And finally, we need to increase the diversity and inclusion that we have in our businesses and in our government. A large and growing body of research shows that diverse teams enhance performance, and less diverse teams eat into profitability. I personally see this in my own organization every day. The best teams are the most diverse teams, ones that include a range of views, backgrounds, and experiences. The bottom line is this: making sure everyone has a chance to generate and nurture their ideas is good for growth. And growth is good for prosperity, and prosperity is good for all of us. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you with a story. A girl from a lower income family does well in school, reads a lot, likes to learn. But the family finances and the family itself fall on hard times. And the young girl, needing to assist, drops out of school and helps out. When she tells her teacher she is leaving, he doesn't blink. He knew her family. And he said he always knew she wouldn't amount to anything, and her decision to leave school had just confirmed it. So then look forward 2 years, and the girl meets a woman named Betsy. And Betsy tells her that the job she wants, to drive a bus, requires a GED. And so do so many other jobs that she might want. So she gets one. And then Betsy tells her that many, many more jobs require college, and she should go. So she does. And on it goes until one day the girl, now a woman, earns a PhD and heads off into the world to try to make a difference. So that girl, as you might expect, was me. And I tell you that story to show one thing. The lens we use determines what we do. My teacher and Betsy saw me differently. And because they saw me differently, they acted differently towards me. Betsy paid for my first semester of college, and my teacher simply erased me. So we can take for granted that the outcomes we see today are inevitable. And we can watch as the pandemic makes existing gaps deeper and our prospects for future growth even slower. Or we can see these gaps as a sign that resources aren't being used to their fullest and that people with great potential are each and every day being kept from realizing it. To my mind, the choice is clear. The will is ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We really appreciated hearing your thoughts and expertise. I think now we have time for some questions. So if you we invite all those participants on our enhanced webinar to go to slido.com and use the code that you will have received in your conference handout to ask your questions. You can see existing questions and upvote the ones you like. And I think what I'm going to do is start with one question. I'll open up Slido on my phone here to frame our discussion, which came up in your talk as well. In the context of studying economic performance and equity, how would you define equity?
That's a terrific question and a good starting point. You know, when I think of equity, I think of access to opportunity. If we really believe, and I do, that we have an opportunity for meritocracy where people come in and they put their talents and their skills into the hopper and then they invest in themselves and then anything is possible, then what that really means is equity of opportunity to do just that. And that doesn't mean that we want to eliminate make everything even or everything the same, because people want to invest different amounts of time in their human capital. They want to do different things. And so some unequal or different outcomes are possible. But equity means everybody has a chance to make that choice, as opposed to we're choosing for them and putting them into buckets that we expect them to live in. And that was really the difference between my teacher and Betsy. You know, one person saw me as I've already achieved my potential and there's nothing else to do for me. And the other person thought that I had more to offer, but I just needed a choice to make that my own.
Thank you. So we have a question about productivity. So there are a number of reasons why labor productivity might differ across individuals, such as educational attainment in the industry and occupation. When we're thinking about income gaps, is there research on how much of that gap is attributable to productivity for whatever reason the productivity might differ?
Absolutely, and that's a terrific question. In fact, that's the starting point for most of the work that people do on gaps. Economists traditionally say, okay, here's a gap, and let's just take between Black and white wages. And I've done this work myself with my colleagues Bart Hobein and Joey Pedke. We looked specifically at that. So you take the gap in Black-white earnings, and then you control for differences in education, differences for industry and occupation, differences in where people live, and because of the geographic issues. So you keep track of all the different things that you think are related to productivity and we can observe and measure. And when you do that and you look over the last 30 years, you find that on average explains about 50% of the gaps between Black and white earnings for both men and women. And so there's a large portion of these gaps that just aren't explained. And if you think, well, that's already a little troubling, the additionally troubling piece is that the part that's unexplained, that's not related to differences in productivity, is growing. And that's where I go back to this statistic I cited in the talk, that over the career for a Black man with a college education, he starts with a penalty on his wage, a difference in his wage we can't explain when he just starts out. But by the time he's 15 years into his career, that difference in wage is larger between his white counterpart. So those are the things that we really don't understand what's driving them, but offerings that people give, and I think these are really things to pursue and investigate, is there's differences in how people think about people, or just, you call it in broad terms discrimination, but what you really want to call it is what are we doing that's limiting the career growth of a Black man relative to the career growth of a white man.
I think that's an excellent transition to another question that's just come in. Would investing in soft infrastructure, so I'm imagining education, educational access, and other things like that, increase the access of ideas from members of the lower income portions of our society?
Well, certainly, it's a necessary, but I would not say a sufficient condition. So let's start with the necessary condition. We all, I think, know that education is a power. It's the most durable investment you can make. It's the only investment people can't take from you in some way. So, investment in yourself and in education is important, and having equal access, or having access for everyone to get that education, is critical. And it's not just about talking about soft infrastructure. It's not just about, getting people into classrooms, getting kids into classrooms. It's ensuring that they have the supports to learn and to continue to grow, so that they're getting full ideas about what's possible for them as they age. The other thing that's, I think, important, though, is, and this is what you find when you look at the data on college graduates, Black college graduates versus white college graduates, what we see is that there's still a wage penalty for those individuals. And so we can't stop just by giving people education opportunities. It's really about career opportunities as they go through the workforce. And, one of my colleagues here who runs our inclusion and diversity group said that, at every juncture, if a person who doesn't look like the norm has to prove him or herself, it just becomes harder and harder and harder. So whether we're doing inclusion and diversity programs in our organizations, or whether we're just giving candidates another look, whether we're not deciding before we talk to people what they're likely to be capable of, all of those things are the important parts about getting it through the labor market, just not doing it on education. But those investments in soft infrastructure, they are absolutely critical. They're just not sufficient.
Now we have a question kind of looking at things from another angle. So equity for many people brings to the mind a social justice issue, but this issue is residing within an economic system. And unequal outcomes may have some benefits by providing incentives for individuals to innovate and increase their incomes. So how would you think about measuring that line between the benefits and the detrimental effects of unequal outcomes?
Well, I guess I don't think of it as a line on a continuum. What I think of it is two different things. Really thinking about what we're talking about when we use similar terms like equity or inequality to define what we mean. So let me start with the one that is about, you don't want to make everything even, just spread rewards like peanut butter across the economy, because then you wouldn't, the allocation mechanism wouldn't work. We wouldn't get people going into more profitable occupations or investing in themselves. We wouldn't be rewarding people maybe who put a little extra effort, time and money for themselves into getting an education and contributing in a big and productive way. So this isn't about the outcomes have to be equal to guarantee that the world is working. This is about something different. This is about starting with the hypothesis or the assumption. I'm just going to start with the assumption, which I hope most people will agree with, that talent and interest and preferences and all of the things that we think make up what you do in your life are randomly distributed across the population, but evenly distributed by race, ethnicity, gender. There's nothing that's going to make Black Americans less able than white Americans or rural Americans less able than urban Americans, and go down whatever list. That is not by group something we should see big differences in. So if that's the case, then you would expect outcomes to be much more equal than they currently are, because people start out with the same interests, talents, preferences. They might be born into different systems, but they will clamor up if the world gives them an opportunity. And so the fact that we're not seeing that happen, that is not an incentive for people. That's demoralizing. So if you see that you work really hard, you do exactly the same thing, but there are barriers, you don't feel like, boy, I'm going to go more. It's demoralizing. So that's the difference. One is about equal opportunity, and the other is about even outcomes, the same outcomes. I'm saying that we will have uneven outcomes because of these differences in interest, preferences, investment, et cetera, but they shouldn't be by group. And the remedy for these group differences is more equitable access to the things, the ingredients that allow people to reach their full potential.
We have a question about monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve has recently started talking about topics like inequality, employment by different demographic groups, and climate change. So in your view, what tools does the Fed have to act on these issues? And do you think they are sufficiently pointed or sufficiently sharp, or are they too blunt to make a substantial move in one direction or the other?
Well, I really appreciate this question, because the answer is we do not have the tools. We do not have the tools to combat all these inequities that we can measure. We do not have the tools to combat climate change. We do not have the tools to combat many of the things that can bridle our economy. And importantly, we also don't have the role. The Congress has been very, very specific about our role. Promoting an economy, sustainable growth that delivers full employment and price stability. And those are our roles in the economy and monetary policy. We take those roles very seriously. So that's a very narrow lane. So then why do we work on these issues, which you just named, which are, obviously under the control of the fiscal agents? Well, we work on them because Congress gave us the goals of price stability and full employment and sustainable growth. And in order to understand where we are in that cycle, do we have a growth rate that's sustainable? Could we grow more quickly? What is full employment? How are we going to achieve price stability? We have to understand the factors that influence the economy. So we have a long history of doing this. You can go all the way back to how we study trade policy or the impact of wars or the pandemic on the economic output. And the same thing holds for these things. We study inequity to understand what closing the gaps would do to potential growth and how much not closing the gaps limits our potential growth. We want to think about full employment, especially after a pandemic. Are all the individuals who currently don't work not employable? Do they not want to work? Or are they capable of working? They want to work, but they're just not queued up in the unemployment rate right now. That matters for both our price stability and our full employment mandates. So the genesis of the discussions you see is the commitment that we've made to the American people to achieve the congressionally given goals, to our full employment price stability, and to do our best to understand the economy we have and help build the economy of tomorrow.
Excellent. Well, I think we're now just about out of time. So Mary, it was a great pleasure and a privilege to speak with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Thank you for talking to all of us here at the Forecast and to all of our viewers. So everyone in the audience and in the virtual audience, please join me in thanking Mary C. Daly, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.